Going on to section 5 of chapter 1, we're dealing with adding real numbers. This is on page 35 in the textbook. Now, again, if anything, you figure you ought to know how to do adding, but in algebra it gets a little tricky. So here they're telling us to add 3 plus 2, and we know we get a 5. But let's look at a couple of things here. These numbers that we're adding have a special name. They're called the addends. So an addend and an addend, when they're united, give you a sum. 5 is the sum. And if we show this on a number line, we start at 0 and go over 3. We are now at 3. We're going to add 2 more units to it. We go over 2 more, and we end up at 5. And in a sense, this is the proof or the illustration of our simple adding. Now, here we're going to add an example to 2 negative numbers. So we have a -1 added to a -2. And we do the same thing. We start at 0, but now we go -1, that's to the left, then 2 more, and we end up at -3. So the adding of -1 and a -2 give you a -3. And this is the proof of it on the number line. Now let's just try a few. The key is if they're both negative, we just add them together and apply the negative sign. So this is going to be a -10. This is going to be a -21. And this is going to be a -12. So if they both have a negative sign, adding them together, we just add them together and apply the negative sign. Now as we go to example 4, notice that one is a negative term and the other is a positive term. And if we use the number line to illustrate this, we have our -4. We start at 0, we go down to -4, and then we're going to add a +6. So again, we go to the right to 6 units, and we end up with a +2. Going on to example 5, here we have a +3 and a -7. Well, we don't want to keep drawing the number line, but we're looking for a strategy to do this. And the strategy is take the larger absolute value, which is a 7, then subtract the smaller absolute value, which is a 3, and that gives you a 4. But now you apply the sign of the larger absolute value, which in this case is a negative. So this is a -4. The technique is when you're doing different sign numbers, you subtract the smaller absolute value from the larger. That gave us the 4. But then use the sign of the larger absolute value, which was a negative. So here our larger is 10. 10 minus 2 is going to be 8. The larger absolute value sign is positive. And this one, there was no problem. Now, when you're subtracting items with decimals, you need to be careful because you need to line the decimals up. So we're going to subtract the smaller absolute value, which is this, from this, and we get here, I have to do that correctly here, a 0.3, and we apply the sign of the larger absolute value, which is negative. And those are our answers. And a strategy for doing when you are adding unlike sign numbers. That's the technique. Now, if you're using your calculator, of course, just putting it in there correctly, the calculator keeps track of the signs for you. And for these, again, we're interested in strategy, what to do. Here we see they're both negative, so we just add them up and apply the negative sign. Here, one is negative, one is positive, so we're going to subtract, get a 30, and apply the sign of the larger absolute value, which is positive already. Here we're going to subtract, and we get a 0.5, and we're going to apply the sign of the larger absolute value. Again, if you're using your calculator, just putting it in that way and being careful of the decimals. I should have kept that lined up here. I moved it over a little bit, but. Now here, notice it's the same sign, and it's the same denominator, so we're just going to add, get a 8 over 10. Remember, that's going to be negative. And now we simplify that to a negative 4/5. Now here, again, we're going to just basically subtract, in this case, since it is negative, the smaller number from the larger. And then here we have a 7. I had to take one away from there. And the sign is correct because our larger absolute value is positive. Here we have to have common denominators, which happens to be a 40. So using the technique we had the other day, multiply that by 5. 5 over 5 is 1. We're going to multiply that by 8. So this will be a negative 15 plus 16. Notice 15 take away from 16 gives us a 1. Again, the larger absolute value would be the 16. We're going to subtract 15. We get a 1. 1 over 40 is our final answer. Going from page 38 and moving on to 39, we're seeing some grouping symbols here, parentheses, but here the parenthesis is just ensuring that you're applying the negative to the 7 and the negative to the 8. Now what you can do here is add these two together, get a negative 15, and then add a 3 to it. That'll leave you with a negative 12. Now you could have done these two first, but it's probably a good idea to work that way. Now here again we're seeing brackets as a grouping symbol, so they want us to do this first. This is going to be a negative 3. And this is going to be a negative 6, and that'll give us then at the end a negative 9. Notice the innermost are parentheses, then it goes to brackets, and if you need more, you go to braces. All right, in example 8, they're talking about a temperature that is 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and then it fell by 111 degrees. What would be the end temperature? Well, here, notice the word fell or it dropped, this implies negative. So this would be 104 plus a negative 111. And again, you're going to subtract that from this, That gives you a 7. And then you apply the negative sign. That was your end temperature. As we move on in this, a review of a topic we had mentioned earlier, finding the opposite of a number. Well, we said our natural numbers are 1, 2, 3, whole numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, and then we define the numbers on the other side of the 0 as negative numbers, and the opposite of whole numbers and their opposite are the integers. So we had mentioned this a little bit before, but here they want us to find opposites of numbers, that is the additive inverse. What number do we add to something to make it a 0? Well, to 1, we would add a negative 1. To 2, we would add a negative 2, and so on. So they're asking us, what are the opposites of these numbers? And the answer then is just its opposite sign. So here, the opposite of a 5 would be a negative 5. A negative 6 would be a 6. A positive 1/2 would be a negative 1/2. And a negative 4.5 would be a positive 4.5. So it's nice to have easy things once in a while, but you need to know the definition. Some of the key words here were the opposite of a number is also its additive inverse. It's what you add to a number to make it a 0. All right, our last topic of section 5 of chapter 1, and we're looking at some interesting expressions here. Now, this is a negative of a negative. Often, the best way to read this is the opposite. Remember we said a negative sign can sometimes refer to the opposite of something. So the opposite of a negative 10, think about it for a moment, is a positive 10. The opposite of a negative 1/2 is a positive 1/2. The opposite of a negative 2c is a positive 2c. And this one we did a little bit, it's a little tricky. It comes out as a 6, and then you apply the negative sign. So the opposite of a positive 6 is a negative 6. So this will be a trick sometime, be careful, because you see the absolute sign, you say, well, that's always going to be positive. But if the negative sign is on the outside, that's when you apply it after you do this operation of absolute value. Okay, there's another section. Hopefully you're keeping up with your practice and quiz bees. And we'll go on to section 6.